over the past few weeks, we've been dissecting what makes an argument good and effective, and what kind of strategies we can use when constructing our own arguments to make sure that we are the most persuasive as possible, because that's our goal in pretty much every avenue of life, to be taken seriously and to be persuasive in some capacity and to hold that authority. And so understanding those strategies is really important, but the next step is to understand how to combat people who do not have good arguments. And most of us can typically find out pretty quickly if somebody has created a good argument or not. A lot of times the logic just literally does not match up for us and we're confused by the end of it. Sometimes they're missing a step. Sometimes they're missing credible information. Sometimes they lack the authority to be talking about that topic, or perhaps it's more emotional. But I want to arm you guys with the tools to combat this, to know how to identify it. And then if you're able to identify different fallacies, you can then construct your own arguments. And so I found, just as a human in the world, this is one of probably the most helpful tools for me in any kind of discourse. So logical fallacies, these are just arguments where the conclusion doesn't follow the premise. So as I mentioned, just bad arguments. And so our goal, again, is to identify them as we're researching, as we're analyzing, both in this class and when you move on to writing 2 or in any other course, because this isn't just something that sticks within like a speech debate class or within an English class. There's different kinds of fallacies that are used within different kinds of fields. So to identify them in our opponent's arguments so we can pretty much attack them, hopefully for good, and to avoid using them ourselves. Some of these are things that we are not aware of. A lot of times if we're too emotional, we may be missing that important step of logic, or we just tend to be reductive in how we explain something, or we misinterpret our audience. And so there's 2 camps of fallacies, and you don't need to know this at all, but I'm just going to throw some terms out to make it seem legitimate. So fallacies of relevance is when there is problems with the evidence. So the kind of examples or evidence you bring in literally doesn't even support the kind of argument you're making. And then there's component fallacies. And this is when you have those errors in reasoning, because we talked about with logos how everything is kind of the syllogism. It's like this big math problem, A plus B plus C plus D equals E. And sometimes we miss the D, or we miss the B, or we miss several of those. And so when you miss one of those components, or you jump too quickly, or you mainly jumping too quickly to conclusions, it ends up failing. And so the main ways that we can identify a fallacy is if the rhetor, the speaker, the writer, whoever, is trying to distract us, a lot of times because they don't have a good argument or they don't have much information about it. If there's just a lack of information, disconnected reasoning again, or aggressive pathos. Those are the 4 things that we look for. And so, did it not link up? Oh, no, it's on there. Okay. And so 2, I'm not going to call them fallacies, but more, I'm going to add them to this list. Stuff we've already talked about that can end up being manipulative or distracting is when we're softening and sharpening language. A lot of times it's really good. We want people to take something seriously, but it can be used a lot to distract people. So this is from a couple days ago. I forget what her role is, the speaker for the White House. She ended up calling cases that are rising, coronavirus cases, as embers. And embers, of course, are those little smoldering pieces in a fire. And so she really softened in a way that downplays the seriousness of what's going on with COVID right now, saying, oh no, it's not this fire. It's not something large. It's just embers, so that you don't think that it's as serious. A lot of times fallacies happen when there's interpretation of information. So a couple of days ago also, Betsy DeVos ended up interpreting what the CDC's original guidelines were for opening schools and said, well, they're supposed to be flexible, which frankly is not how I thought government agencies, we should take their information to interpret it how we want. But of course, the effort for both of them is to misinterpret and hopefully soften their approach and make people sort of believe their party line instead of trusting these other organizations. So we're going to look at 4 different camps. One are the distractions, those fallacies that are meant to distract you away from what the premise is, a lot of times because you lack good information. One is the misconnections. So if you are, again, missing one of those pieces of logic, One is bad ethos, where you are just using your ethos incorrectly. And lastly, the mean ones, where usually you are lashing out and using force in some way, or racist appeals in some way to prove your point. And we'll go through all of these. I have a couple examples. Just a quick note at the top of this is that I do use a lot of political examples. It's going to look like it skews very, very left. I've mentioned before that I don't hide my political preferences. However, if we had a Democratic Party in the office, we would have more opportunities for this kind of rhetoric. Right now, we just happen to have a president who is not as rhetorically trained as other public officials that we've had. And so it's a lot easier to identify some of this stuff. We could go to any politician and we will find fallacies that they use. So this is something common that everybody deals with. I think what's happening right now in this administration is that it's a little easier for us to see and identify those. So even as a teaching method, it's more helpful. So please don't be offended. You can believe whatever you want to believe, and that is fine.